The sun had barely crested the horizon when Wyatt Callahan realized the universe had a peculiar sense of humor. There, leaning against his splintered fence, like it owned the place, stood a stallion so black it seemed to swallow the dawn light whole. Just yesterday, he'd given his last good mare, Old Bess, to that Shoshone girl without a second thought. No strings, no trade, just a kindness. And now, this devil-eyed beast stared him down like it was settling a debt. Wyoming in 1881 didn't believe in coincidences, and neither did Wyatt. He'd spent the previous day riding the boundaries of the Lazy Bee, his boots kicking up dust as he checked for gaps in the barbed wire. The land stretched wild and untamed beyond his property, a sea of sagebrush and rattlesnakes where a man could disappear faster than $1 in a Dodge City saloon. The ranch was all he had left after the diphtheria took Martha and the baby 2 winters back. Some nights the silence out here was louder than a cannon blast. Bess had been steady beneath him, her copper coat gleaming like a new penny as she picked through the arroyo. The canyon walls rose up around them, striped with layers of ancient rock that told stories older than sin. Then she froze, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. Wyatt squinted past the glare and spotted movement near a slump of boulders. At first he figured it for a mule deer, but then he caught the flash of beaded moccasins. The girl couldn't have been more than 16. Her braids tangled with prairie wind eyes, wide as a spooked Mustang. She'd been trailing a wounded pronghorn, its blood speckling the stones. Easy now, Wyatt murmured more to himself than the mare. He dismounted slow, keeping his hands visible. The girl didn't bolt, just watched him with that same unreadable stare his Pawnee tracker friend Tom Broken Hand used right before calling him a fool in 3 different languages. Without a word, Wyatt loosened Bess's cinch and slid the reins toward her. The girl's fingers brushed the leather, hesitant like she expected a trick. Then she was gone, leading the mare toward the horizon, like a ghost fading into the dawn. Wyatt chuckled darkly as he hiked back to the ranch. Hell of a trade, Callahan, he muttered to the empty plains. But the joke was on him, because now this midnight stallion stood in his corral, chewing through his last bale of hay like it was judging his life choices. And if that wasn't enough, the beast had brought company, a rattlesnake coiled neat as a pocket watch. At the gatepost, its tail singing a warning tune, Wyatt spat into the dirt. Ain't no such thing as a free horse, he drawled, reaching for his lariat. Somewhere beyond the ridge, thunder growled like a hungry cougar. The land always collected its dues. The air in the canyon hung thick with the scent of juniper and old stone. As Wyatt studied the girl, the young woman who stood like a shadow given form. Her crow beadwork glinted in the fractured light, each pattern a story he'd never learned. Close up, he could see the scar running from her left temple to her jawline, pale against her skin, a battle mark or an accident. Out here the difference hardly mattered. Survival left its receipts. Easy does it. Wyatt murmured, his voice rough as saddle leather. He kept his hands wide, fingers spread like he was calming a skittish colt. The woman, Iana, she called herself, didn't blink. Her gaze tracked the colt peacemaker on his hip, the way a hawk follows a field mouse. Wyatt made a show of easing the hammer down with his thumb. Ain't here for trouble. A sudden gust sent dust devils spinning between them, and that's when he saw it, the glint of metal at her throat. A cavalry button, the kind officers wore, strung on a leather cord. His gut tightened. Last winter, he'd buried 3 7th Cavalry deserters near Crazy Woman Creek. Their coats had been stripped of buttons. Iana caught his stare and curled her fingers around the trinket. A gift, she said, voice low as a creak over stones. From a man who thought it would buy more than it did. The way she said it made Wyatt's knuckles itch. Behind her, the canyon walls whispered with ancient paint, buffalo herds, frozen mid-charge warriors on horses, no taller than dogs. Wyatt had seen ledger art before, but this was different. These pigments were mixed with something dark. Blood, maybe. The figures seemed to shift when the light hit them just right. "Your people did this?" he asked. Iana's laugh was bitter as willow bark. "My people are dead. These are warnings." She pressed her palm against a faded handprint, and for a heartbeat, Wyatt swore he heard drums. Then the wind changed, carrying the acrid tang of smoke. Iana went rigid. "You have fire at your ranch." Wyatt's blood turned to ice. The Lazy Bee's cook stove hadn't been lit in days. He spun toward his horse, just as the stallion let out a scream that split the sky. The black beast was rearing eyes, rolling white, and beyond it, oh Christ, a wall of flame crowned the ridge like a second sunrise. Iana was already moving, snatching a leather pouch from her belt. "Dumb white man," she hissed, tossing him a handful of gritty powder. "Rub this on your skin. The fire comes for more than trees today." Wyatt caught the pouch and smelled copper and sage. Medicine or madness didn't matter now. The horizon was burning, and the painted warriors on the canyon walls seemed to lean forward, eager for the show. The fire's roar faded behind them as Wyatt and Iana spurred their horses through the canyon's narrow mouth. Copper's hooves kicked up sprays of red dust that clung to their clothes like bloodstains. Wyatt could still feel the heat at his back, could still hear the crackle of juniper bursting into flame. But it was the other sound that set his teeth on edge, the high, keening wail riding the wind. Not the fire. Something alive. Something hunting. Iana reined in sharply, her hand flying up in warning. The stallion danced sideways, nostrils flaring. "Listen," she whispered. At first, Wyatt heard only the thunder of his own pulse. Then it came again, that unearthly cry, closer now. The hairs on his neck stood straight. "Mountain lion, or worse." Iana's fingers tightened on the cavalry button at her throat. The fire woke the Mapiyashicha, the shadow that walks. My grandmother told stories. It follows disaster, feeds on the lost. Wyatt spat. "Hell of a time for ghost stories, woman." A gunshot cracked in the distance. Then, another. Not random shots, a pattern. 3 quick, 2 slow. The universal cattleman's distress call. "Your people?" Iana asked. Wyatt's stomach dropped. The Lazy Bee crew should have been miles north, moving the herd to summer grazing. If they were firing warning shots. "We ride." He kicked the stallion into a gallop, Iana keeping pace without hesitation. As they crested the ridge, the ranch sprawled below them, or what was left of it. Flames licked at the barn, and a dozen panicked longhorns milled in the corral, their terrified bellows mixing with the shouts of Wyatt's men. But it was the figure standing motionless in the center of the chaos that froze Wyatt's blood. A man, if it was a man, cloaked in what looked like swirling smoke, his outline shimmering like a mirage. Every animal gave him wide berth, even in their panic. "Mapiya Shitia." Iana breathed. She yanked a bone-handled knife from her belt and sliced her palm open. Before Wyatt could stop her, she smeared a crimson streak across Copper's forehead. "Ride hard. Don't look back." The stallion needed no urging. It charged downhill like the devil himself was snapping at its heels. Wyatt drew his Colt, though every instinct screamed that bullets wouldn't touch what waited below. The shadow man turned slowly, and for one heart-stopping moment, Wyatt saw his own face, reflected in that featureless darkness, but older, twisted with eyes, as black as a starless night. Then Iana was there, her voice rising in a chant that seemed to shake the very air. The thing hesitated. And in that heartbeat of uncertainty, Wyatt did the only thing that made sense. He threw his grandfather's silver pocket watch into the dust between them. The Mapayashicha recoiled like a scalded cat, its form rippling. "Go!" Wyatt roared at his men. "Drive the herd east." As the first raindrops began to fall, too late to save the barn, but just in time to save their skins, he locked eyes with Iana. Her bloody hand still gripped that cursed cavalry button. Questions could wait. Survival came first. The land always collected its dues, but tonight they'd cheat the devil one more time. The black stallion stood like a statue in the pre-dawn light, its breath curling in frosty plumes, despite the summer heat. Wyatt's skin prickled something about the way it stared at him, unblinking, like it had been waiting 100 years, just for this moment. Then he saw the brand on its flank, a crude circle with 3 slashes through it. The mark of the Three Rivers outfit, a ranch that had burned to the ground in '78, after its owner got on the wrong side of a Cheyenne war party. Wyatt took a slow step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Easy, boy," he murmured, though the horse showed no sign of skittishness. It just watched him with those eerie, pale eyes too damn intelligent for any normal animal. A sudden gust of wind carried the scent of wood smoke and something else beneath it, copper and sage. The same smell from Iana's medicine pouch. The stallion's ears twitched toward the eastern ridge. Wyatt followed its gaze and saw the silhouette against the rising sun, a rider motionless watching. Even at this distance, he knew it was her. The stallion let out a soft nicker and stamped one snowy hoof. That's when Wyatt noticed the bundle tied to the fence post, a rolled-up deerskin secured with a strip of red cloth. Inside lay a knife with a bone handle, its blade blackened by fire. Iana's knife. And tucked beneath it, a single eagle feather. Wyatt's throat tightened. This was no accident. That stallion hadn't wandered onto his land, it had been sent. The memory of last night's fire and that thing they'd faced flashed through his mind. Maybe some debts couldn't be repaid with a horse. Maybe they stretched deeper, older. The stallion snorted and tossed its head, suddenly impatient. Wyatt reached for its mane, half expecting to grab empty air. But the horse was solid, real, its coat warm and damp with sweat. It didn't shy away as he swung up bareback. As they crested the ridge where Iana had stood moments before, Wyatt found only a single crow arrow planted in the earth, its shaft still vibrating. East, toward the Powder River country, toward something that needed doing. The stallion needed no reins. It knew the way. Wyatt settled in, feeling the strange rightness of it, like he'd been riding this ghost horse his whole life. Behind them, the first true rays of sunlight set the prairie ablaze with gold. Somewhere out there, a woman with a copper mare and a debt to settle was riding hard. And Wyatt Callahan, who thought he'd given away his last good horse, found himself smiling for the first time in years. The land always collected its dues, but sometimes, just sometimes, it paid a man back in kind. The stallion moved through the corral, like a shadow given form, its hooves kicking up puffs of dust that hung golden in the morning light. Wyatt leaned against the fence, rolling a cigarette between his fingers as he watched the beast inspect every inch of its new prison, though prison didn't seem right. This horse walked like it owned the land beneath its feet. By noon, the temperature climbed high enough to make the horizon shimmer. Wyatt tossed his hat aside and hauled water from the well, filling the trough to the brim. The stallion watched, ears pricked forward, as the water sloshed against the rusted metal. Then it did something that made Wyatt's blood run cold. It dipped its muzzle and blew across the surface, sending ripples outward in perfect concentric circles. Just like the old Shoshone trick Iana had used to read the future. "You're no ordinary horse, are you?" Wyatt muttered. The stallion lifted its head, water dripping from its muzzle like liquid silver. For a heartbeat, Wyatt swore. He saw something move in its eyes, not just intelligence, but recognition. Then the moment passed, and it was just a wild animal. Again, shaking its mane with a snort. That evening, as Wyatt mended a broken harness by lantern light, a sound made him reach for his Colt, a low, mournful howl that wasn't quite a wolf's. The stallion erupted into motion, kicking up clods of dirt as it raced along the fence line, its nostrils flaring at some scent Wyatt couldn't detect. Then it stopped dead, facing north, where the Medicine Bow Mountains cut jagged teeth into the twilight sky. Wyatt squinted. At first he saw nothing. Then movement, a flicker of torchlight weaving through the distant pines. Not white men. Not with that many fires. His gut tightened. That was Arapaho land, and they hadn't held a mountain ceremony since the soldiers came through last summer. Something was stirring the tribes up. The stallion pawed the ground, its breath coming fast. Wyatt knew that look. It was the same restlessness he'd seen in cavalry mounts before a battle. He grabbed his saddle blanket on impulse and stepped into the corral. "All right, you devil," he murmured. "Let's see what you're made of." To his shock, the stallion stood rock still as he threw the blanket over its back. No biting, no kicking, just the same eerie patience. When Wyatt swung up bareback, the horse didn't buck. It simply turned north, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. As they galloped into the gathering dark, Wyatt caught a glimpse of his reflection in a rain barrel, and for a split second, his face was painted with the same red ochre markings as the warriors in Iana's canyon. The land was speaking. Finally, after all these years, Wyatt was listening. The moment Windrunner's muzzle touched Wyatt's chest, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind died. The crickets fell silent. Even the fireflies hovering near the corral froze mid-flash. Then the stallion reared back, with a piercing whinny that echoed across the valley like a war cry, and from the distant hills came answering calls, dozens of them, a ghostly chorus that raised the hair on Wyatt's neck. Ayana's brother, Tall Bear, he called himself, gripped his bow tighter. "The wild herd comes," he murmured. "They follow their king." Wyatt barely had time to process the words before the ground began to tremble. Over the ridge poured a river of horses, their coats gleaming like molten metal. In the twilight paints, Appaloosa's mustangs with manes like storm clouds. They circled the ranch in a thundering vortex, kicking up a dust storm that smelled of sage and lightning. Then the strangest thing happened. The lead mare, a fierce-looking pinto, with one blue eye, broke from the herd and charged straight for the corral. Wyatt braced for impact, but at the last second she skidded to a stop, her nose inches from Windrunner's through the fence rails. The two horses touched muzzles, and Wyatt could have sworn they were communicating. Ayana's hands flew to her mouth. "The blue-eyed mare. She was my paint's mother." Her voice cracked. "I thought the soldiers killed her when they—" A gunshot cracked in the distance, cutting her off. Then another. Tall Bear's head snapped toward the sound. "Pony soldiers," he spat. "They hunt our people again." Windrunner suddenly wheeled and kicked the corral gate. With such force, the hinges screamed. The message was clear: time's up. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He threw open the gate and vaulted onto the stallion's bare back. As the wild herd parted before them, like the Red Sea, Wyatt glimpsed the cavalry torches winding down from the north, dozens of them. The 7th was on the warpath again. Ayana swung onto Copper's back, her brother mounting the spare horse. As they galloped past the ranch house, Wyatt grabbed two things from the porch: his Winchester and Sarah's old quilt, the one she'd stitched with morning stars. The last thing he saw, as they raced east, was the turquoise horse charm glowing like live coal in his saddlebag. its light pulsing in time with Windrunner's strides. Some gifts were meant to travel. Some debts were meant to be paid in blood. The land was speaking, and tonight Wyatt Callahan would answer not as a rancher, not as a widower, but as the man Windrunner had chosen. The ghosts of the plains were riding again, and the cavalry would learn what real fear tasted like. The first snow came early that year, dusting the plains like powdered quartz. Wyatt woke to find Windrunner standing sentinel outside his window, frost clinging to the stallion's black mane like diamonds. But it wasn't the cold that made Wyatt's breath catch. It was the sight of fresh cougar tracks, circling the corral, stopping abruptly where Windrunner's hoofprints began. The big cat had come hunting, and thought better of it. Ayanna arrived at midday with her uncle Gray Owl, who carried a rawhide bundle that smelled of sweetgrass and something sharper. "The soldiers took our winter stores," she said, her breath making ghosts in the air. "Your gift kept my people alive last month. Now we return the favor." Gray Owl unwrapped the bundle to reveal a bow made of Osage orange, its string woven from buffalo sinew. "For the horse rider," he grunted. "The land remembers those who listen." Wyatt tested the bow's pull, smooth as river stone, powerful as a Winchester. As he ran his fingers along the carvings, he realized they told a story, a stallion leading men and animals through a starless night. The exact scene from his dreams these past weeks. That evening, Tita, as they sat around Wyatt's hearth, sharing venison stew, Gray Owl produced a small drum from his pack. The rhythm started slow, like a heartbeat, then quickened as Ayanna began to chant, in a language that made the firelight dance. Windrunner, who'd been dozing outside, suddenly appeared at the window, his eyes reflecting the flames like twin suns. Then came the miracle. The foxes from the root cellar slunk in, followed by the eagle from the dead pine. Even the old grizzly that normally avoided humans lumbered up to the porch, its scarred muzzle pressed against the window pane. Wyatt felt the hair rise on his arms, not from fear but from the rightness of it. This was how the world was meant to be. Gray Owl stopped drumming. "The horse brought more than peace," he said quietly. "He woke the old ways." Outside, Windrunner reared with a cry that shook snow from the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle blew, the iron horse bringing more settlers, more soldiers, more of the new world. But here in this circle of firelight and friendship, something ancient had taken root. Wyatt caught Ayanna's eye across the flames. She smiled, and in that moment, he understood the true gift Windrunner had brought. Not just balance between man and nature, but between past and future. The land would keep changing, but its heart, the wild, untamed spirit that connected them all, would endure. As the embers faded, Wyatt realized the loneliness was gone. In its place sat something warmer, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Outside, the first wolves began to howl, not in hunger, but in celebration. The long winter was coming, but for the first time in years, Wyatt wasn't afraid. He had a stallion who spoke with thunder, a woman who walked between worlds, and a land that remembered its promises. That was enough, more than enough. The spring grass whispered beneath their feet as Wyatt turned to Ayanna, the words tasting both foreign and familiar on his tongue. "I know our peoples have different ways," he said, watching Windrunner rear against the horizon, his black mane catching fire in the sunset. "But I reckon love ain't got much to do with borders." Ayanna didn't answer at first. She just reached into her doeskin pouch and pulled out two things, a dried sprig of prairie sage and the cavalry button she always carried. With deliberate hands, she pressed the sage into Wyatt's palm and threw the button into the wind. It caught the light for one brilliant moment before disappearing into the tall grass. Little Wolf chose that moment to come barreling around the barn, whooping like a wild thing, a string of fish slung over his shoulder. "Caught supper," he hollered, then skidded to a stop when he saw their faces. His grin turned sly. "About damn time." The wedding happened at the next full moon, under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to touch. Gray Owl painted Wyatt's face with red ochre, the same shade as the canyon paintings, while the women braided copper beads into Ayana's hair. When the time came, they didn't exchange rings. Instead, Wyatt placed his father's battered Stetson on Ayana's head, and she tied a beaded knife sheath around his waist. Windrunner presided over the ceremony, like a four-legged priest stomping his approval, when Gray Owl declared them husband and wife. The Stallion's herd had grown over winter, 3 new mares, their bellies round with foals. As the drumming reached its peak, the horses suddenly bolted east in unison, their hooves shaking the earth. Little Wolf whooped again. "Good sign means strong children." Wyatt barely heard him. He was too busy watching Ayana, his wife, laugh as she spun in circles, her beaded dress catching the moonlight. Somewhere out in the darkness, a lone wolf howled, and for the first time in his life, Wyatt howled back. The land had given him more than he'd ever dreamed, not just a future, but a living, breathing testament to the power of second chances. As the embers died down and their guests drifted away, Wyatt found the turquoise horse charm in his pocket, warm as living flesh. He pressed it into Ayana's hand, closing her fingers around it. "For our firstborn," he murmured. She smiled, that same knowing smile she'd worn the day they met. "Windrunner already chose," she said, nodding toward the pasture, where the stallion stood guard over a newborn foal coal, black with one white sock, just like its sire. The circle was unbroken. The land always kept its promises. The morning they buried Windrunner, the entire valley came to a standstill. Crow elders stood shoulder to shoulder, with cattlemen, their hats removed in respect, as Wyatt lowered the stallion's blanket-wrapped body into the earth. Just as the first shovelful of dirt fell, a piercing cry split the air. A golden eagle circled overhead, its talons clutching a single prairie rose. The flower landed softly on the grave, its crimson petals bright against the dark soil. Years later, when the railroad men came with their contracts and their whiskey smiles, Wyatt showed them the herd of black horses grazing near Windrunner's hill. "Them's not for sale," he said, watching his granddaughter, little Ayana, with her father's stubborn chin, race bareback across the pasture on one of Windrunner's great-grandfoals. The railroad boss sneered, tapping his ledger book. Progress don't wait for sentimental old men. That night, Wyatt dreamed of the stallion for the first time in years. Windrunner stood at the canyon mouth, where they'd first met Ayana, his coat shimmering like liquid night. When Wyatt reached for him, the horse turned and galloped east, toward the reservation, where the government was trying to force Ayana's people. He woke with a start, the turquoise horse charm burning hot in his palm. At dawn, Wyatt rode out with 50 head of Windrunner's descendants, their hooves drumming a war song against the hard earth. They arrived as the soldiers were loading the last of the Crow families onto wagons. Little Wolf, now a grown man with streaks of silver in his braids, stepped forward with a weary smile. "Took you long enough, brother." What happened next became legend. The black horses moved as one, forming a living wall between the soldiers and the wagons. No rearing, no biting, just an unshakable presence that no whip or rifle could disperse. The railroad men cursed. The soldiers hesitated. And in that moment of uncertainty, Wyatt produced the deed he'd spent months securing, a legal ownership of the canyon lands in both his name and the Crow Nation's. The carved turquoise horse still sits above a fireplace, though now it's in a ranch house with electric lights and a telephone. The grandchildren tell the story of how their grandfather's gift came full circle. How a man who gave away his last good horse received not just a legendary stallion, but a family of future and a chance to make things right. On quiet evenings when the wind blows just right through the canyon, old-timers swear they can still hear hoofbeats, not just one horse running, but many their wild hearts beating in time with the land that shaped them. The greatest treasures, after all, are the ones we share. The town of Windrunner grew into something extraordinary, a place where the clatter of typewriters in the land office mixed with the rhythmic pounding of hide drums during the annual equinox celebration. Visitors from back east would stare slack-jawed at the sight of Crow elders in full regalia, debating cattle prices with Stetson-wearing ranchers over cups of bitter black coffee at the Silver Saddle Saloon. One blistering summer afternoon, a delegation from Washington arrived with a peculiar request. They wanted Jake to testify before Congress about his unusual methods of frontier diplomacy. As the politician's polished carriage rolled past children playing stickball in the streets, white Crow and Mexican kids, all shouting in a joyful mix of languages, the lead congressman mopped his brow and muttered, "This shouldn't work. By all accounts, this shouldn't work." Ayanna, now silver-haired, but still sharp as a skinning knife, served them her famous chokeberry pie before dropping the truth like a stone in still water. "You're looking at it backward," she said. "This land was always meant to be shared. We just stopped fighting that truth." The real miracle revealed itself during the Great Drought of '98. While neighboring ranches withered to dust, Windrunner's wells never ran dry. Some said it was because of the ancient irrigation channels the Crow workers had restored. Others whispered about the prayer feathers tied to every windmill. Whatever the reason, when Jake opened his springs to everyone, no questions asked, the line of grateful families stretched clear to the horizon. Their youngest daughter, Morning Star, became the first woman admitted to Montana's territorial legislature. On her first day in office, she wore her mother's beaded belt beneath her tailored suit and placed the turquoise horse charm on her desk. "The land remembers," she told her skeptical colleagues during her maiden speech. "It remembers who took, and it remembers who shared." Years later, when Jake finally rode out the last time, his body frail, but his eyes still bright, the entire territory mourned. They buried him beside Windrunner on the hill, where the view stretched forever. That night, a storm rolled in, unlike any seen before. Lightning danced across the peaks in shapes that looked for all the world like a running stallion. The old-timers nodded and poured whiskey on the ground. Some bonds never break. Some gifts keep giving. The charm still sits in the territorial capital, its blue-green surface worn smooth by generations of hands. Visitors rub it for luck, though Morning Star always said the real magic wasn't in the stone. It was in the choice her father made. That dawned so long ago, when a lonely man gave his last good horse to a stranger and discovered the West wasn't wild at all. It was just waiting for someone to see it whole. Sarah Ayanna Morrison's medical practice became the stuff of legend, a place where Crow grandmothers and Harvard-trained doctors compared notes over steaming cups of bitterroot tea. Patients would arrive to find her wearing a white coat over her beaded moccasins, sterilizing surgical tools beside bundles of sacred sage. When the influenza epidemic of 1903 swept through the reservations, she single-handedly inoculated 300 people in 1 week, mixing smallpox vaccine with echinacea tincture in a whiskey bottle. The youngest Morrison child, Thomas Windrunner, penned his first book by lantern light in the old bunkhouse. Two Skies, One Land became required reading at West Point after a young lieutenant used its principles to prevent a massacre during the Ute Uprising. The passage they still quote today reads, "A man who only knows one story is like a horse with blinders. He'll walk straight off a cliff rather than turn his head." As for the horses, well, you could spot a Windrunner descendant from a mile off. Not just by their distinctive black coats, with those 4 white socks, but by the way they'd pause mid-gallop if they sensed a rider losing balance, or how they could find water in country that'd kill lesser animals. Ranchers paid top dollar, but Jake's grandchildren always kept a dozen or so wild in the high pastures. For the next lost soul who needs finding, they'd say. The winter of 1891 birthed another legend. When the blizzards trapped a group of Jesuit missionaries near starvation, Jake's sons led a rescue party straight through a whiteout, guided only by the ghostly glow of a blue-eyed mare who appeared out of the storm. The priest swore she had no tracks in the snow behind her. Old Jake just smiled and said, "Some gifts keep giving." By the time the 20th century dawned, you couldn't swing a lasso in Montana without hitting someone touched by the Windrunner legacy. The trading company's signature saddlebags, woven with crow geometric patterns, but lined with Chicago steel rivets, became a status symbol from San Francisco to St. Louis. The Morrison land dispute mediation techniques were adopted by the Supreme Court. And every spring when the prairie flowers bloomed around Windrunner's grave, the town would hold a rodeo where crow riders performed daring acrobatics alongside Basque shepherds and Texas bronc busters. On his deathbed at 89, surrounded by great-grandchildren of every shade, Jake's last words weren't about land or legacy. He gripped Sarah's hand and whispered, "Tell me again about the day your mother first rode copper." As the story was told, his eyes went distant, seeing not the weathered ceiling above him, but a sunlit canyon where a lonely rancher and a wild stallion had once crossed paths with history. Outside, a new foal took its first wobbly steps in the corral, its coat black as midnight, its socks white as surrender. The land remembers. The circle continues. The railroad's arrival in Windrunner didn't bring the chaos Jake feared it brought pilgrims. Eastern journalists came first, their notebooks flapping like startled quail as they documented the miracle in Montana. Then came the curious railroad barons, expecting to find some shrewd businessman behind the success, only to discover a leathery old rancher who paid his crow cowhands the same wages as his white ones. Jake's memoir sessions became legendary. He'd hold court on the porch of the Silver Saddle, dictating to a rotating cast of grandchildren, while old tribal friends corrected his recollections. "You're forgetting the part where you fell off Windrunner into the creek," Little Wolf would cackle his own grandchildren laughing along. The resulting book, Gifts of the Wild Country, sold out its first printing before the ink dried. Harvard professors quoted it, alongside Thoreau, while illiterate cowboys passed dog-eared copies around bunkhouses like sacred texts. When the Santa Fe Railroad tried to strong-arm the town into moving its depot, Jake didn't reach for his rifle. He invited the executives to dinner. By dessert, they'd agreed to build around the sacred cottonwood grove, where Ayana's ancestors were buried. "That old man could charm honey from bees," the railroad president later told his board. Aistani outlived Jake by 15 years, though she always said part of her went with him that quiet morning. Her foundation sent the first Apsaluke lawyer to Yale, the first Crow woman doctor to Johns Hopkins. But her proudest moment came when the tribal council, once skeptical of her mixed marriage, asked her to help draft their constitution. The Ranch Museum still operates today, though the world around it has changed. Visitors can ride Windrunner's great-great-grandfoals along original fence lines or sit in on classrooms where children learn calculus and the old star stories side by side. The turquoise horse charm now rests in a glass case, its placard reading simply, given freely returned a thousandfold. On summer evenings, when the light slants just right across Windrunner's grave, old-timers swear they see two shadows standing guard, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other small and straight as an arrow. The railroad still runs, the town still thrives, and the West remembers its wild heart. Some gifts, it seems, never stop giving. The museum visitors never expected the chill that would run down their spines when standing in that weathered corral. Guides would pause their speeches mid-sentence as a sudden gust of wind set the cottonwoods whispering, and every soul present would feel it, the peculiar electricity of a place where miracles once happened. School children would fall silent, without being told, their small hands instinctively reaching for the rough-hewn fence posts where Windrunner first stood waiting. Old Maria Tallgrass, the last living student from Ayana's original school, still gave tours at 93. She'd point to the depression in the dirt where the stallion's hooves had stamped impatiently that first morning, now preserved under glass, like a sacred relic. "You stand there barefoot," she'd instruct skeptical teenagers, "and tell me you don't feel the thunder." Not one of them ever could deny it. The real magic lived in the stories that weren't on any placard. How during the Dust Bowl years, when neighboring counties starved, Windrunner's wells never ran dry. How during World War II, when the government tried to relocate Crow families, every single horse on the reservation went missing for precisely 3 days, just long enough for the paperwork to mysteriously disappear. At sunset, when the last bus pulled away, the caretakers would often find fresh hoofprints circling Windrunner's grave, too large to match any living horse in the stables. The security cameras never captured anything, but the groundskeepers stopped questioning the wild roses that appeared every June, their roots tangled with fragments of turquoise stone. Scholars wrote dissertations about the Morrison effect, how communities that adopted Jake's principles saw crime drop and harvests increase. Economists marveled at the trading networks that still funneled prosperity through the valley. But the old Crow grandmothers tending their gardens knew the truth they'd whisper. As the wind picked up, the stallion never really left. His hoofbeats just grew quieter, woven into the rhythm of everyday miracles. A teacher buying lunch for a hungry student, a rancher diverting water to a neighbor's parched fields, the way strangers in Windrunner still tipped their hats to one another like the old days. As the stars emerged over the Bighorn Mountains, visitors would linger by the corral, straining to hear what the wind carried. Some claimed it was just the creek rushing over stones. Others swore how they caught the distant thunder of galloping hooves. But everyone, without exception, left with the unshakable sense that generosity wasn't just something you did. It was something alive, running wild through the world, waiting to be invited home.